There we go. Okay. So really pleased to see you guys here. I know there's a couple other people who aren't joining us who will be watching later, but have an interesting topic for this evening about all the very many people who have claimed to be the Messiah over the period of Jewish history. There's actually quite a few, far more than I could fit onto a slideshow, although I've attempted to do some highlights. And it is interesting to us because often we don't talk about them. Not only do we not talk about the most famous, who of course is Jesus, but we also don't talk about the many others in Jewish history who have shaped the course of Jewish history. Every period of time has had at least one person who has claimed to be the Messiah and who has been believed by others, sometimes with hugely significant historical effects, including our present day, by the way, not necessarily just a phenomenon of the past. So what we're going to attempt to do is take a little survey from the biblical period until the 20th century of different people who have claimed to be the Messiah and try and get a sense through this of what the role of the Messiah means to people, where it comes from, what we mean when we say that, and perhaps the benefits and more likely drawbacks of belief in messianic figures. Tends not to end too well, as we'll see, for the people who believe at least. So I'm going to share my screen. I've got, unusually for me, I've got a presentation version, and we'll see if this works well. Hopefully you can see that. Everyone see that? Yeah, thanks, David. So just to say, on top of it here, we got our most famous within the Jewish community Messiah claimant, who we'll come to in a few minutes, who actually we could do like 4 hours just on, who's Shabtai Tzvi. But rather than just talk about him, we're going to get to him. Kind of wanted to take a bigger look at some of the variety of people who have come on the scene and claim to be the Messiah. But first, we kind of need to get a sense of what we mean when we say the Messiah. So literally, the word Mashiach in Hebrew is someone who's anointed, and it's pretty simply spelled out for us by Maimonides here. And this is from his medieval code of Halakha, the Mishneh Torah. He says, if a king shall arise from among the house of David, studying Torah and occupied with commandments like his father David, according to the written and oral Torah, and he will impel all of Israel to follow it, and to strengthen breaches in its observance, and will fight God's wars, this one is to be treated as if he were the anointed one. If he succeeded and built the holy temple in its proper place and gathered the dispersed ones of Israel together, this is indeed the anointed one for certain, and he will mend the entire world to worship the Lord together, as it is stated, for then I shall turn for the nations a clear tongue, so they will all proclaim the name of the Lord, to worship God with a united resolve, from the underrated prophet Zephaniah. So Maimonides gives us a very helpful and very clear breakdown here of what it is we're talking about. Now, keep in mind, he's writing in the midst of a period in which this has already become a major aspect of Jewish belief. It wasn't originally, but he nonetheless gives us a good framework. So many people might qualify for being potentially a Mashiach, the anointed one, in that it's someone who's a king. So we have several criteria. Someone who's a king of the house of David, so a descendant of David, who's very religious, studying Torah and occupied with commandments, who's encouraging other people, both according to the written and oral Torah, impelling Israel to follow the Torah, and is a military leader fighting God's wars. Those 4 or 5 criteria is what allows someone to be the potential Mashiach. But actually, he's only actually the Mashiach if he succeeds in doing all those things and builds the holy temple in its proper place, not just anywhere, in its proper place, and gathers all of the dispersed of Israel together, all the people around the world who have been put in the diaspora, then this is the one who's for certain the Messiah and will mend the entire world. Okay? Now, as you might notice, there's nothing particularly supernatural about this description. It's just a really, really, really effective political leader, largely. Someone who meets all these criteria is very unlikely, partially because these are very difficult things to do. To encourage everyone to observe the Torah, to rebuild the temple in the right place, to win all of God's wars, it's very unlikely anyone would succeed. But we get, nonetheless, an image of what it is that we mean when we say Mashiach is someone who is purely human and a political leader primarily. Yeah, David.
Just another condition that to point out, in addition to all this is only according to Rambam.
Yeah, so this is one of the only systematic descriptions, and we're reliant on.
My point is, even then, would that be accepted? Because in your notes, I've got to admit, I did a little bit of homework.
Good. Yeah.
And because, as most people here know, and those that don't, I'll confess, my English isn't perfect. And I looked up the word heretic or heresy. I think you wrote heresy in the original, and I wanted to actually have that defined in my head exactly what it was. And it came up about heresy in the Jewish religion, and even Maimonides was considered a heretic himself.
Yeah.
So
Yes,
there you have it.
absolutely. There's subjectivity to what we mean when we say Mashiach here, and we're going to go back and see where it comes from. But we're first starting quite a bit ahead, right? Maimonides is 10th, 11th century. He's writing a halachic code. He's writing instructions for us to identify someone, but that's actually 1,500 years after people started showing up and claiming to be this thing. So exactly as you say, we have to be somewhat suspicious of whether this is universally agreed upon to be the criteria. But it is helpful for us to then look at why are some people treated this way, and what are the features that make them, according to most, if not all, Jewish sources, eligible to be considered the Mashiach, or even truly considered the Mashiach. And I want to put this first, because we're going to return to this. As we look at these different men, and they're all men, I need to consider, do all of them meet this criteria? Do any of them meet this criteria? Being descended from the house of David, observant of the Torah, encouraging everyone to observe the Torah, fighting God's wars, building the holy temple in the right place, gathering everyone back. It's a big remit, right? And actually part of the problem is that no one ever meets these criteria, which is probably why Maimonides labels them the way he does, because he's quite nervous about the idea of a Messiah, which we'll see again in a minute. Now, the first person to be labeled Mashiach is not a Jew at all, certainly not a descendant of the house of David. The first person, and the place that it really comes from, is King Cyrus, Koresh, who was the king of the Persian Empire, Achaemenid Persia, in around the year, he comes into our scene, obviously, toward the end of his life. And after the Jews have been exiled to Babylon in 587 or so, a few years later, Cyrus leads his army of Persians and Medians to destroy Babylon, takes over, and one of the first things he does is permits the Jews to go back to the land of Israel and to rebuild the temple. As a result, the Israelites, are very supportive of him, so much so that they label him, as we see in Isaiah, the Mashiach. Right? The beginning of Isaiah 45 says, "Thus God said to his anointed, Mashiach, to Cyrus, whose hand I have strengthened to subdue nations before him and the loins of kings. I will open the doors before him and the gates won't be shut." It's a strange verse and it's strange grammar. But it's clear from this that Isaiah, at least, and this is not the original Isaiah, but the other Isaiah, is living through a time in which he believes that a foreign king, Cyrus, is the one who is accurately labeled Mashiach. Clearly, he doesn't have the same criteria as Maimonides will 1,500 years later, because Cyrus is not a descendant of the house of David, nor is he necessarily doing all the things that were labeled above. In addition, we see Ezra, a little bit later, talk about Cyrus in similar language, quoting Cyrus. "Thus said Cyrus, king of Persia, Adonai, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has charged me with building God a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah." So the impetus to build the second temple comes directly from Cyrus, king of Persia, who, at the time that he's giving the Israelites these instructions, rules the largest empire the world has ever seen. His empire, this is before Alexander the Great, before certainly all the ones that come after him, Rome, Mongols, etc., stretched through from basically what's now Iran to what's now Turkey, and included huge swaths of land. And as a result, he was seen as quite a supernatural figure for the period of time in which he ruled, which was fairly short. He was also evidently quite tolerant of the peoples that he ruled, or at least understood practically that he was better off being friends with them than being enemies with them. And we see in other texts, by the way, from Babylon, which Cyrus also conquered, that when he conquered Babylon, he went and rebuilt the temple to Marduk in the center of Bavel, in the center of the city of Babylon. So clearly he was kind of playing both sides of the game, and actually was just a shrewd politician, perhaps, who understood that if he wanted everyone to like him, he should just support their religious beliefs. But it worked, in that the Israelites see him as someone who is anointed by God, who is a Mashiach, who is destined to lead people back to the kingdom and to rebuild the temple. And in that regard, we have those elements that Maimonides describes here in Cyrus for the first time about rebuilding the temple and about leading people back from diaspora. Now, does anyone know what religion Cyrus was? What religion his empire was?
Zoroastrian?
That's right, Lee. He was Zoroastrian. And a lot of this imagery probably is owed to the influence of Zoroastrianism, a faith which developed in Persia gradually and kind of unevenly from the 7th century BCE and on. That faith, Zoroastrianism, which probably it was not one religion but a variety of traditions as usual, we label it as one word, had several defining features. One is that it understood there to be two gods, not one and not many, but two. One which was good and one which was evil, and understood the good God and the evil God to be locked in a war with each other. It also was one of the first faiths to identify time as being linear, meaning there was a beginning and there will be an end of time, and that's the key part for us, in that Zoroastrianism was quite concerned with the end of time, the final battle between the good God and the evil God. And Zoroastrianism introduced the idea of there being an individual, a human individual, who would be anointed by the good God to be his messenger on earth and to lead the charge in the battle against the evil God. He's called many different things. The original word is something like Shayoshant, and that person is basically one of the models for what the Mashiach comes to mean. At this time, when Isaiah and when Ezra, who surely were familiar with Zoroastrian belief, if nothing else because they're living in a Zoroastrian empire, were probably inspired by and influenced by Zoroastrian traditions and Zoroastrian understandings of individuals, and this idea of there being a special human who would come save the day at the end times. All of the beliefs that enter Judaism during this period, kind of 6th century to 2nd century BCE, beliefs like the resurrection of the dead, the end of time, the apocalyptic language in some of the prophets, the Messiah figure, the battle between good and evil, Armageddon, etc. All of that probably is due to the influence of Zoroastrianism during this period, because obviously we don't see any of that in the Torah. Right? In the Torah itself, there is no mention of there being a Mashiach. There's no mention of there being an end of time, nor of there being any cosmic battle, nor, of course, is there any evil God. There's only one God. That's the whole point, good and evil. So we have quite an interesting change happen during this period, which is largely due to foreign influence. And probably much of what we understand by the word Mashiach is also due to the influence of Zoroastrianism. And you can see that in the combination of the two in the person of Cyrus. Feel free to interrupt me, by the way. Now we're jumping way ahead here. We're going to jump to the first... Sorry, I must have skipped a slide.
Sorry, Rabbi, I was just wondering, I didn't quite hear properly. The human being in that these Zoroastrians assume will be on earth, does he represent both the good and both gods?
No, he represents the good God.
The good God, okay.
He is the emissary of the good God, and as a result is someone who's seen as a supernatural human figure, something which was foreign to the Judaism of the Torah, right? Of course, there's no mention in the Torah of anyone being anything other than human. It actually goes to quite a length to make sure that we know Moses is just a human being, right? Although we might be inspired to see him as more. Now, you'll notice from this one, Shimon bar Kosiba, that we've skipped to the year 135, which means we skipped over quite a bit. And of course, one of the people that we skipped over included in that is perhaps the most famous Messiah claimant in Judaism, which is Jesus of Nazareth. And I don't want to spend too much time on him, actually. I did have a slide, but evidently I deleted him, which I take no symbolism in that, just a mistake. But if you look at, for instance, the 13th chapter of Matthew, the 16th chapter of Matthew, Jesus is explicitly asked by his followers, are you the Mashiach? Are you the anointed one? And he says, yeah, I'm that guy. Right? So there is an explicit discussion, even if we just look at the Gospels between Jesus and his followers, in which he identifies himself and is identified by others as the Mashiach. which means, of course, that he's expected to lead a political rebellion, to take sovereignty of the land of Israel, to rebuild the temple, which is already still there, but Jesus was wanted to purify, and to bring all the people in diaspora back, if we take Maimonides' word for it. It's quite a drastic image for someone who's a pretty simple preacher in the countryside. But that probably explains a lot of the understanding of the New Testament and the stories therein, is that the idea of the Mashiach at the time, after Cyrus, influenced by Zoroastrianism, expanded to be kind of God's emissary on earth, right? The good God's representative who was going to fight the battles, win the wars. That is in some way what Jesus identifies himself with. Now, of course, for his Jewish followers, when Jesus dies, he's not the Mashiach, because it's a title, not an inherent quality of a person. And we see that. We don't have a lot of Jewish sources about Jesus because they weren't too keen to talk about him, just a few. But we do have a lot of Jewish sources about someone else who comes about 100 years later, named Shimon bar Kosiba. So this is after the destruction of the temple in the year 70. The Jews are sent into exile. Some survive living in the countryside of the land of Israel. And gradually another guerrilla warfare rebellion emerges against the Roman occupiers. And in the year 132, 133, somewhere around there, this guy named Shimon bar Kosiva, who becomes known by his nom de guerre bar Kochva, leads a rebellion against Rome and is actually surprisingly successful. So we have here a military commander. No mention, by the way, in the sources that he's descended from David, although that's one of the expectations and one that Jesus identifies. Notably, the New Testament gives a whole genealogy of Jesus to explain how he's descended from David. Bar Kochva never claims he is, but he does lead the Israelites to regain sovereignty over the land, to rebuild partially the temple, and to start to bring people back from exile. As a result, there was a divide among the early rabbis as to whether or not he was the Mashiach. And you can see that. So this first source is from the Jerusalem Talmud, in which Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, a generation later, is talking about Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was one of the most famous rabbis of the generation of 130 to 140. And Rabbi Akiva, it tells us, when he saw Bar Kochva, would say, "This is the King Messiah," right? Hu HaMelech HaMashiach. So Akiva supported Bar Kochva's claim to be Mashiach, which is a big deal because Akiva was one of the most significant rabbis of the generation. But if we consider that what Akiva meant by that is that Bar Kochva was a successful military leader who seemed to be succeeding in getting rid of the Romans and installing Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, then maybe it makes sense. And we can see in the Talmud elsewhere, now this is the Babylonian Talmud, so it has a different point of view than the Jerusalem Talmud. They talk about him, they call him by his original name, Bar Kosiba. Bar Kochva, by the way, is a nom de guerre, means son of a star, which is on the basis of a verse, which you can see above, in which Rabbi Akiva would interpret a star has arisen from Jacob. And the reason he got the nickname Bar Kochva, son of a star, is because Akiva thought that verse applied to him, that he was a star who has arisen. So there's this language of him kind of rising up to defeat the baddies and represent the goodies. The Babylonian Talmud says the following: Bar Kosiba ruled for 2.5 years, and he said to the sages, "I'm the Messiah." They said to him, in the case of the Messiah, it's written that he senses the smell of a man and judges. Let us see whether you can sense the smell of a man and judge. When they saw that he could not sense the smell of a man and judge, they killed him. Okay, so we have a very different picture here in the Babylonian Talmud about what happened. You can see that Akiva clearly is the minority because the sages referred to anonymously clearly didn't believe him to be the Messiah after testing him, ended up killing him. Yeah, David?
In that quote from Talmud Bavli, it says, "It is written that he senses." So where is that written? Does it give a source for where it's written?
So it doesn't there, but it's based on interpretation of an Isaiah passage, which refers to a similar notion, although Isaiah is notoriously confusing, about this idea of smell being linked with the possibility of an extraordinary person. I'd hesitate to say that Isaiah is talking about the same person, because it's not clear that he is, but there's no doubt that they understood him to do so. So it comes from, I'm just looking it up, it's the famous passage Isaiah 11, which is the original Isaiah. And yes, so the English, the King James has, he shall sense the smell of the truth by his reverence for the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes behold, nor decide by what his ears perceive. And this goes back to the same place where we see, but a shoot shall grow out of the stump of Jesse, which is why Jesse, being David's father, is why Maimonides labels the Messiah as being someone who has to be descended from Jesse, is that we understand this passage of Isaiah to be talking about some Messiah-type figure. And so the rabbis take this very literally, it would seem, this idea that he can sniff out people's character by smelling them and test him, and when they find that he fails, they kill him. Which is quite extraordinary, especially considering the rabbis don't want to talk about what happened with Jesus, but they seem to be talking in some way about Jesus through the example of Bar Kokhba, who was in many ways similar, except he was more of a military leader than a spiritual one. Just to note that a rabbi in the medieval period, David Ibn Zimra, who's very famous, he comments about this and he tries to balance it to say there's no doubt there was disagreement about him. Some didn't believe he was the Messiah, some did. Rabbi Kiva did. Even after they went to test him whether he could sense the smell of a man, Rabbi Kiva didn't change his mind. It wasn't until he was killed that all agreed he wasn't the Messiah. So you have this, once again, very clear statement that death is obviously the end to the claim to be a Messiah because it is a title. It is something you do while you're alive. There's no connection between the inherent idea that an individual is always and in all times and before and after death the Messiah. That idea is quite foreign and comes probably more from other traditions, but of course becomes the basis of Christianity. Jesus is the Messiah even after he dies and returns to life, as the New Testament teaches. So that's clearly something that's resisted by many of these mainstream Jewish sources. Just to point out, going back to Maimonides here briefly, he comments directly on this question about someone having the ability to sense the smell. He says, one should not entertain the notion that the King Messiah must work miracles and wonders, bring about new phenomena within the world, resurrect the dead, or perform similar deeds. This is not true. Okay, so he doubles, triples down on this idea that the Messiah is actually not extraordinary. The Messiah is the Messiah because of what the Messiah does, not because of who they are. Which obviously is somewhat a response to Christianity, but does clearly have a basis in those early encounters with claimants to messiahship, especially Shimon Bar Kokhba, who, by the way, of course, wasn't successful in his rebellion. Everyone ended up making a last stand at a place called Beitar, which ended very badly. And there was a huge amount of mass suicide, similar to the episode that we find at Masada, if you've been there. Similar group of people, different time period. Okay. Just jumping ahead a little bit, just to show you kind of the diversity of different people here. We find this guy, we don't know much about him, this guy named Moses, who lived on the island of Crete. Crete, of course, being an island off the coast of Greece. And this is now a couple hundred years later, properly in the Christian period. And this was still while the Talmud is being codified. Okay, so many of the rabbis of the Talmud, in particular, one of the last rabbis, a guy named Rav Ashi, who you can see referenced here in this first sentence. This is just taken from the Jewish Encyclopedia. The rabbis of the Talmud had tried to restrict people's expectation. They tried to say, oh no, the Messiah is not going to come. He's only going to come far later. And as a result, they ended up inadvertently setting this deadline at the time that he'll come sometime between 440 and 470. So one individual took advantage of that expectation, it seems. This guy named Moses, that's all we know about him, and convinced the entire Jewish community of Crete, according to the sources, Greek sources at the time, that he was the Messiah. And as a result, you had all the Jews of Crete waiting, and there's quite a few, by the way, waiting for him to lead them to the land of Israel and retake the land of Israel in a glorious show of sovereignty, which everyone would rebuild the temple. Of course, that didn't happen. So they even make such a dramatic statement. This is from a Greek author, Socrates, not that Socrates, a different Socrates, who describes all of the Jews following this guy into the sea. What a great image, right? A guy named Moses leading a bunch of Jews into the sea, where of course it doesn't split this time, and instead they understand they all drowned. You can see in the narration from Socrates, Moses commanded them to throw themselves down as the water would be divided before them, like the original Moses. The Jews obeyed, and many of them lost their lives in the sea, while others were rescued by mariners. Moses is said never to have been seen again. So rather an embarrassing end for this guy named Moses in the 5th century, who of course tried to imitate the original Moses, claimed he was the Messiah, claimed they were going to walk from Crete across the Mediterranean back to the land of Israel, and instead just kind of led a bunch of people to drown in the ocean. it's hard not to see in some of these stories certain parallels with modern cults. I don't know if anyone remembers, but I remember being very young and learning about the kind of Jim Jones cult in the States, and everyone kind of partaking in these fantastical mass suicides, believing in UFOs, drinking the Kool-Aid, an expression we still use today because they poisoned Kool-Aid. It's hard not to see a similar phenomenon happening here. We don't know much, but we know this. There was a charismatic leader who took advantage of people's expectations of a certain time being important, who convinced people that he was going to lead them to safety and back to sovereignty, and the result is a lot of people died, very sadly. Right. Now, jumping ahead once more, I realize we're jumping around a lot, but there's a lot of people to talk about. This guy we don't know a great deal about. There's actually two people here. A guy mostly known as Abu Isa, which by the way means father of Jesus in Arabic. His full name was Yitzhak ben Yaakov Ovadia Abu Isa ha-Isfahani. Would be a bit of a pain to call up to the Torah, I imagine, each week. But he was quite an unusual Messiah claimant in that he didn't come from a scholarly background, as the others seem to. He wasn't supported by the rabbis or by mainstream Jewish community. He took advantage instead of the upheaval and chaos in society at the time. Now, if you look at the dates, and these are rough dates, of 680 to 720, you may realize this is immediately after the founding of Islam. This is during those first years, the first generation, when Islam swept across the Middle East, and during the first caliphate that united all of the Muslim companies and communities together. There was understandably a lot of chaos, a lot of refugees, a lot of people wandering around the countryside, and a lot of spiritual and religious speculation. And Abu Isa took advantage of this. He was Jewish. He couldn't read. He was a tailor, according to most accounts, who seemed to have introduced a new interpretation of Judaism and changed some things. Now, again, going back to Maimonides, where we started, one of the things you'll remember he said the Messiah had to do for him was observe the Torah as it is, the written and the oral Torah, meaning not innovate, not add new things, not say, oh, you don't have to do that. Of course, this is a response to Christianity, which said, oh, you don't need to worry about kashrut or brit milah or Shabbat, etc. But you see that that's exactly what happened in many of these cases. And one of the things that defined Abu Isa in the very beginning is that he changed people's dietary practices. He suggested that no one should eat meat or drink wine, and he banned divorce. Based probably on inspiration from Christian and some early Muslim communities. And in a very overachieving move, he rejected the 3 times a day prayer by Jews or the 5 times a day prayer by Muslims and went for 7 times a day prayer in his own community. It does seem like he had a large community of followers for a short period of time. All of the sources, all in Arabic at the time, do talk about there being a group who are called the Iswaites. So there's enough people who followed him that they got their own name. But it doesn't seem he himself claimed to be the Mashiach, the person who would be anointed and lead everyone back to sovereignty. He just was very influential in introducing a new interpretation of Judaism. He was influential enough that he attracted the attention of the caliphate's rulers, enough so that they actually went to battle against the caliphate, and he lost terribly, as you might imagine. But after he died in the battle, one of his chief followers, a guy named Yuqdan, which is probably the Persian equivalent of Yehuda, right, the tribe of Judah, continued the sect of Abu Isa and grew it even more. And he did claim, it seems, to be the Mashiach and claimed to lead people back to the land of Israel. According to one Jewish traveler from Spain named Binyamin Mitudela, a guy named Benjamin from the city of Tudela, who traveled across the Mediterranean and wrote a kind of travel diary, a lot like Marco Polo's travels. Binyamin Mitudela describes this as being actually quite a big sect of people and is still having a ban on meat and wine and divorce and praying 7 times a day. And although they disappear after a generation or two, we can't imagine that these groups didn't have a huge influence on other fringe Jewish groups. And what we see is that there's the emergence in the 9th and 10th centuries of something called Karaite Judaism, which is a type of Judaism that rejects the Talmud and only holds by the Torah. So it's kind of anti-oral Torah. It's a bit more complex than that, but that's the simple version. And there's still Karaites today, and there have been large communities. But probably the emergence of Karaite Judaism is due largely to these innovators, many of whom claimed to be the Mashiach during this time in which Islam was kind of roiling across the Middle East, and which Jews were sharing in and influenced by that and shaped by it. There were many others, by the way. Maimonides, again, we keep coming back to Maimonides, but one of the reasons he writes so clearly about this is because during his own lifetime, he was written to by many people, particularly famously by a group of Jews in Yemen who claimed that there was someone there who claimed to be the Messiah, who was attacking Jews who didn't believe in him and executing Jews who rejected him. And they asked Maimonides what they should do about it. And he wrote a famous letter back to them in Yemen, trying to encourage them to hold fast and not worry and reject this person who claimed to be the Messiah. And that's partially what inspired his own rules that we saw at the beginning about who a real Messiah would be. So again, as David said, it's very aspirational, Maimonides' rules, because almost all the people who did claim to be the Messiah didn't meet those rules. And that's exactly the point. Anyone can claim, and it depends really on how many people follow them in their belief. In most of these instances, these people were a minority, right? They were small groups in isolated places. The exceptions were the first example of Cyrus, who appears to have been believed by most Jews to be the anointed of God, although it didn't mean the same thing then that it came to. But after the Christian period, it comes to be basically that the Messiah of Judaism would be an anti-Messiah in Christianity, and they tend to be quite small. A group of Jews in Crete, a group of Jews here in Persia in the early Umayyad Caliphate, and a few other instances in Yemen, elsewhere, where you have small groups of people believing in an individual. It starts to get a little bit more dramatic when global commerce starts to develop more. And there's someone in particular named David Alroy, probably originally El Roi, meaning God is my shepherd, who was born in Persia once again. This is 1160. And he did declare himself to be the Mashiach, and he took advantage of the fact that Jews were very unhappy at the time, and as a result tried to convince the Jews that he would lead them against their Muslim rulers and back to the land of Israel. So he actually managed to summon an army of Jews in northern Persia and in what's today Iraq, Mosul and Baghdad, and defend his own city against the local Muslim rulers. And he obviously did not succeed, but it did inspire him to be quite a legend. So the Jews in the area, in northern Iraq and in southern Persia, northern Persia, in the area that we now know as Iran, were quite inspired that this guy was going to be successful. And again, it's a military aspiration that he was going to lead them to victory against their enemies. Of course, that wasn't the case. And according to the legend, as you can see here, he was assassinated while sleeping by his father-in-law. Rather a embarrassing end for what sounds like quite a victoriously interesting guy. The local Muslim rulers weren't very happy, of course, with this attempt, and as a result, Jews were persecuted afterwards. What's funny about this, I don't know if anyone's read it, I haven't, but this legend story, probably based in fact, as we do have other sources, inspired one of the many novels of Benjamin Disraeli, a one-time prime minister, who wrote a novel called David Alroy, in which he kind of romanticizes this Jewish resistance to the Muslim rulers at the time. I don't know if the novel's any good, but it's interesting that some of these things perpetuate themselves deep in the consciousness, so much so that 1,000 years later, nearly, you have someone writing a novel about this individual in a really small, relatively isolated area, but who inspired this idea of resistance to the enemy. And we're going to see that quite a bit. That actually the Messiah is often the person who is leading the resistance to the enemy. We see that with Jesus, who is seen as the Messiah because he's seen as the leading the resistance to Rome. And we see that with Shimon bar Kokhba and with many of these other individuals. Next up, we've got one of my favorites, a mystic and Kabbalist named Abraham Abulafia, who had a very tumultuous and complicated life, but he was one of the people who claimed to be the Messiah. Unusually, he doesn't seem to have any followers. He wasn't very good at making friends, this guy. But he did believe himself to be the Mashiach for a brief period of time. He had a vision in about 1279, most of the way through his life. He's probably about 40 years old, in which he needed to go convert the Pope. It becomes the tradition after Abulafia that one needed to prove they were the Mashiach by converting the ruler of the time, the Pope, the Sultan, whomever, to Judaism. It never quite works out, as we can see. And it starts with this story of Pope Nicholas, who is known to be quite anti-Jewish, by the way, so is particularly brave. And in 1280, Abulafia shows up in Rome, claiming that he's coming to convert the Pope. The Pope is out of town, but gives instructions to the guards to burn Abulafia on stake. The legend is, of course, that he walked past the stake only to discover that that night, as he was making his way into the city, the Pope had died of a stroke. He started to return back to Rome, which was not where the Pope was, but the Franciscans evidently imprisoned him, believing that he had hurt the Pope. And, by the way, he encourages this. In his own writing, he kind of insinuates that actually it was his curse that killed the Pope, which is probably not the case, by the way. But he did end up in prison for a while. Shockingly, they didn't kill him, and somehow he got free and escaped. He ended up living the end of his life on an isolated island all by himself in the Maltese archipelago. So he probably didn't have much chance to inspire other people to believe him to be the Mashiach. But it goes to show that actually, as time goes on, the title of Mashiach is less and less about historical reality, which it was originally, with Cyrus, a non-Jewish Persian king, and it becomes more and more about individual charismatic leadership. Some people, who we know as people who claim to be the Mashiach, didn't appear to have any followers at all. And Abulafia really does, although it's a brief episode and it doesn't have much impact on other people, it does inspire in some way and change the narrative that actually what the Mashiach might be is not obviously a military leader, or not obviously someone who's a descendant of King David, or not obviously someone who's going to lead all the Jews back to sovereignty in the land of Israel, but might be someone who's a bit more hidden and a bit more esoteric, but very charismatic. And that has a big impact on what happens after. Although he's a minor episode, it's a pivot point in the history of these people who claim to be the Messiah. He seems to have renounced it, by the way, later in life and felt bad about this episode, but it's hard to know. A little bit later now, once again, if you note the dates, all of these are dates where there's huge chaos happening in society around people, especially around Jewish communities. These two gentlemen, David Reuveni and Shlomo Mochel, which is a great name, were active at the time of the expulsion from Spain and immediately afterwards. These were really properly kind of romantic, bizarre stories. Reuveni claimed he was a con man, basically, who claimed to be the ambassador of an imaginary country in which the lost tribes of Israel were living. And he convinced quite a few European monarchs, including the Pope, that he was this person, and that the Jews back in his imaginary country somewhere in Arabia were fighting against the Muslims, but they just needed money for guns and cannons in order to fight. Now, this is after the Crusades, but at a time in which most of European rulers were quite sympathetic to the idea of a small group of Jews valiantly fighting in the mountain against the Muslim overlords. And as a result, he actually got a huge amount of money, right? This guy ended up in the papal court, meeting the Pope. He ended up visiting quite a few of the European monarchs in Portugal, in England, elsewhere. He became kind of a celebrity adventurer rogue who was raising money for an imaginary army in an imaginary country, which he was going to go back supposedly and lead all of the Jews in his imaginary army country back to the land of Israel. This didn't work out, as you might imagine, but he did meet someone, and this becomes a trope as well, who made it even more exaggerated and more dramatic, a guy named Solomon Mochel, Shlomo Mochel, who was one of many people who had converted to Christianity during the persecutions of the previous century in Spain, but now was returning to Judaism. Now, there was hundreds of thousands of Jews who had been Christians for a generation or two or three, and during these years, in the early 16th century, were trying to return to be Jewish. As a result, they had quite a large degree of influence because they were seen by European monarchs as being slightly more acceptable than other Jews, because they were kind of Christians, kind of Jews. And actually, he ends up having just as big of an influence and being Reuveni's right-hand man. This all backfires, though, when the Holy Roman Emperor realizes that he's actually originally a Christian. And of course, if you're a Christian who becomes a Jew, then you're a heretic, a word that we learned and talked about a bit earlier, someone who goes away from normative religion. And as a result, he was burned at the stake. But the episode, the adventures, the romantic tales of these two guys traveling around Europe and their imaginary country of Jews back in the Middle East who were fighting against the Muslims inspired a huge amount of messianic fervor. right? And in so much so that immediately after there was a series of episodes in Spain and in Portugal where individuals were claiming to have encountered the spirit of the Messiah, who was either usually Molcho, was understood to be that man. And famously, there was a young girl who was 15 who inspired a huge amount of people. She was known as the in Hebrew, the Bitula, the Virgin of Herrera, which of course is Christian language, right? All the virgin saints. And she was proclaimed a prophetess, and hundreds of thousands of people followed her until she was burned at the stake by the Inquisition. So incredible kind of huge upheavals in society, and largely the result of these two individuals who were kind of creating this narrative of Jewish sovereignty being possible. That the Jews were going to restore themselves to the land of Israel, rebuild the temple, there was going to be a king from the messianic line of David, etc. Taking advantage of that narrative and taking advantage of people's fears in order to sell this idea of there being a return to Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. Obviously ended once again in disaster. Now, they were followed not too long after by the most famous fake messiah, who is Shabtai Tzvi. Now, Shabtai Tzvi is super duper interesting. I mean, there's really a lot to say about him. He took all of the things that we've seen in all these other cases, but he was the most successful by a huge margin. So he was born to quite a wealthy family of merchants in Turkey, in what's now Izmir, was then called Smyrna. And early on, he is seen by the rabbis around him to be kind of a nutter. He had all sorts of strange practices and claimed all sorts of strange things. He ran a synagogue briefly and started calling women up to the Torah. And this led to a huge upheaval among the rabbis who kind of put him in cherem, which is the ban of excommunication. He ultimately is just kind of seen as rather a depressive figure who struggles with his own mental health until he meets two people. So while traveling, he meets a woman named Sarah, who appears to have been a prostitute, and whom he marries and becomes his wife. And he meets a guy named Nathan from Gaza, Nathan of Gaza, who becomes his promoter. Now, as is often the case with these stories, Shabtai Tzvi himself wouldn't have become very significant. But with Nathan as his promoter, who is a marketing genius, he becomes hugely successful at convincing Jews across the world that he is the Messiah. Not for any particular reason, by the way. Now, it's largely due to the fact that there's a new printing press. People can share information much faster. Word is spreading much faster. Jews are traveling much faster. And there's a huge amount of expectation, once again, messianic expectation, in the Christian world at this time, particularly centered around the year 1666. Due to Christian prophecies, Nostradamus and others, people really believed in Christian Europe that 1660s was going to be the end of the world. By the way, that belief is also partially what inspired the English Civil War. Cromwell never would have been able to do what he did and cut off the king's head and everything else if people didn't believe that it was the end of the world. So Shabtai Tzvi takes advantage of that. He also took advantage of the fact that shortly before 1640s, 1650s, there was a series of pogroms, the worst pogroms in European history, that happened in what's now kind of Central Europe, Poland, Ukraine, etc., by a local Cossack warlord called Chmielnicki, who killed somewhere between, and this tells you a little bit about our estimates, somewhere between 30,000 and 300,000 Jews in the course of a few months, rampaging around the countryside and just randomly, wantonly murdering, raping, and assaulting Jews. So this was a really bleak time for most Jews. They were really distressed. They were really feeling like everything was going sideways. The world was ending, apocalyptic fervor. And along comes Shabtai Tzvi, who has this kind of bizarre story and this very energetic, charismatic promoter. And what's amazing is that according to most scholarly estimates, 2/3 of Jews in the whole world believe that he was the Messiah. 2/3, a majority of Jews believe that this guy was the Messiah for a short period of time, around 1666. And it comes to a head, this huge fervor worldwide, when he actually has to go confront the Sultan, who is the most powerful leader at the time. And he says, as Abulafia tried earlier with the Pope, he says to the Sultan, I'm here to convert you to Judaism. I'm going to be the Mashiach. We're going to go back to the land of Israel. And the Sultan says, great, we can kill you instead. And as a result, Shabtai Tzvi converts to Islam overnight. And his conversion to Islam, along with kind of 400, 500 of his followers, leads to an absolute collapse in this messianic fervor. And in the 1670s, as word spreads that actually turns out he wasn't the Messiah, turns out he converted to Islam rather than do anything he's supposed to do, it leads to a huge amount of soul searching, of inquisition within the Jewish community. Rabbis start accusing other rabbis of being secretly Shabbatiyans for hundreds of years after, including up until today. The aftershocks of this episode are still being felt in how Judaism structures itself in the stress between religious communities and secular communities. It is absolutely impossible to overstate the degree of influence that the episode of Shabtai Tzvi has had on Judaism ever since, right? Including the creation of Hasidism, right? Hasidut, which is probably a result of the Shabbatian movement collapsing and people trying to find other outlets for the same spiritual vocabulary, and including the fact that we now have similar structures around how we see heresy and orthodoxy and whatever else. The whole idea of orthodoxy, the whole idea that there is a right Jewish belief and a wrong Jewish belief, only emerges in the 1670s, 1680s, because people are trying to find out who's a Shabbatian and who isn't, who still believes in this guy and who doesn't. And as in other times, there was a group of people who believed that Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah even after he died, and continue to believe in him. And in fact, there's even a small group in Turkey today of families, 400 years later, who still follow this tradition and still believe that Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah, but yet practice a kind of Jewish-Muslim fusion syncretic religion. They're small, but they still exist. So it's really, really, really important for us to understand, if we want to understand modern Judaism, we have to understand Shabtai Tzvi, how it is actually a culmination of all these other episodes before, and how it's a break, really, with everything that came before and everything that comes after. We can't really understand what Judaism was like before this, because we can't really understand what it's like for 2/3 of the Jewish world to believe that some random guy from Izmir was actually the Messiah, and then be very disappointed to discover that he wasn't. Take us to the present day. Many of you may recognize this smiling face. This gentleman, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, is the 6th Chabad Rebbe and the last Chabad Rebbe, because there hasn't been another Chabad Rebbe. And Chabad, of course, is one of the Hasidic schools. And during his lifetime, which was 1902 to 1994, noticeably he was the Chabad Rebbe during the war and after the war. He built Chabad into what it is today, which is a huge, extremely powerful infrastructure, arguably the most successful Jewish messianic sect ever, right? The only person who may have been more successful than Shabtai Tzvi is the Chabad Rebbe. And although he was smarter than Shabtai Tzvi in that he didn't claim to be the Messiah, many people believed him to be, and he did not resist this. He did not ever contradict this. And during his lifetime and after, many Chabad followers openly believe him to be the Messiah, even though he has died. Some people believe he hasn't died. Some people believe he actually is in hiding. Some people believe that even though he died, he's still the Messiah. And even if you find Chabadniks, or people of Chabad, Lubavitchers, same group, by the way, Chabad and Lubavitch, who would say, no, we don't believe he's the Messiah, they nonetheless, in every house, in every restaurant, in every building, in every school, have photos of him on the wall and include prayers for him in their prayer services, and have yet to appoint another Chabad Rebbe, because in some sense he still is the Chabad Rebbe, even though he is long since deceased, which is pretty shocking. Right, and many people who encounter Chabad don't realize that they have this messianic dimension. Every single Chabad rabbi today and every single Chabad emissary or missionary, called shluchim in Hebrew, believes in one way or another that they are bringing about the end of the world through asking people to do mitzvot, and as a result they will return to a time at which the Messiah, whoever that might be, although many believe it's this guy, is going to come and bring everyone back to sovereignty in the land of Israel. This is despite the fact that during his lifetime, Jews did achieve sovereignty in the land of Israel. And this is the great conflict. Jews have achieved sovereignty in the land of Israel, haven't rebuilt the temple, which by the way is a good thing, but we have achieved sovereignty in the land of Israel. There is once again such a situation, but no one sees that as a messianic statement, although some have begun to, because it wasn't connected with religion. It was a secular endeavor. But the years since, 1970s and 1980s, have led to the construction of a kind of religious Zionism, which is now very influential, which does see the Zionist project as a whole as a messianic project. And you can see how this idea, going all the way back to Cyrus, right? From Cyrus, king of Persia, to Menachem Mendel Schneerson is a long time and many countries and many different experiences of Jewish communities. But some things are shared in that they often have an attribute of fear and uncertainty, and there's often an attribute of belief in the ability of an individual to restore sovereignty to the land of Israel. In 2021, there is Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, but as a result, there's even more confusion, even more messianic speculation about what this might mean for this idea of the anointed one, including people trying to find descendants of King David, including people who are actively planning to rebuild the temple so that the Messiah can come back and restore temple worship. There are people right now literally sharpening knives in Jerusalem, waiting for the temple to come back so they can practice sacrificing animals. It is today, just as much as it was in this guy's lifetime and in the previous people we saw, a time of great upheaval, and as a result, a time at which it's very likely that these messianic impulses can come and be influential. I think that's the most important thing in some way, is that this, I love this quote, this is from the encyclopedia, in the article in the Jewish Encyclopedia from the scholar Zvi Rovalsky about messianism, right? He actually really puts his finger on it, that messianism, whether it's an individual or a movement or a time period, or whether they're dead or alive or Jewish or not, flourishes and develops in periods of suffering and frustration, right? When everyone's happy, it doesn't need to be redeemed, but it needs to be renewed. But when the present is profoundly unsatisfactory, messianism emerges as one of the possible answers, the certainty of a satisfactory, natural, social, and historical order. And this was particularly strong in Israel, based as it was on God's promise, enshrined in God's covenant, is projected onto the horizon of an ideal future, right? As the biblical account amply shows, already in biblical times, the present was generally perceived as far from satisfactory. Bad kings, enemy incursions, defeats, and hence ideas concerning an ideal order under an ideal Davidic king began to crystallize. And what we see in this very, very rapid, and apologies, very brief survey in some way of messianic claimants in Judaism is that all the way back to Persian King Cyrus, through the people who have had a huge influence on society. Obviously, there's probably no human being who has influenced our contemporary society more than Jesus, inadvertently, who, of course, is one of the people that fits into this trope. Shimon Bar Kokhba and Jewish messianism at that period, up through all the diaspora Jewish communities in Crete, in Persia, in Iraq, in Spain, in Portugal, in contemporary modern Europe, in addition to the echoes that still remain from Shabtai Tzvi in Europe of 400 years ago. It's something that we've never really escaped, and yet we've never really resolved. And when we go back to where we started with Maimonides' statement about what makes for the Messiah, there's a purpose to him being so specific, because none of these people has ever met those criteria. And that's, of course, his point, right? Is that the criteria are unattainable. Despite that, it has never stopped Jews, especially in times of trouble, from hoping for and believing that there will come about an exceptional person who can satisfy all their desires, bring them back to the land of Israel, fight God's wars, and be successful. And I think it's both kind of a reminder that we're not as free from this as we might imagine, and also a caution that we're very susceptible to this, especially in a time like our own, that we look at this history and study it, because we can learn a lot from it, both about what to do and perhaps more what not to do. I realize I've just absolutely blasted through that. Questions, comments, thoughts? Anyone thinking about becoming a Messiah now? It's not too late.
Interested in Nathan's marketing strategy.
There's lots of good stuff written about Nathan and Shabtai. Nathan used the imagery of he used a combination of different kind of imagery. One was very Christian imagery, in which he depicted Shabtai and Sarah as this kind of holy family. And if you look at a lot of the art that was commissioned for posters and things, there's a lot of Christian imagery of him kind of sitting on a throne in the clouds. But he also took advantage, as most good marketers do, of technology. This was a fairly new time for the printing press and for Jewish publishing, and he was absolutely brilliant at disseminating materials which would be useful to people and which would subtly introduce the idea to them of Shabtai Tzvi as the Messiah. The most famous example is the Tu B'Shvat Seder. So the Tu B'Shvat Seder, which, by the way, many of us still do today, was invented by Nathan of Gaza as a marketing ploy to support the messianic claimant of Shabtai Tzvi. So he wrote the first Tu B'Shvat Seder, and he published it and sold it to Jewish communities, being like, here's a new ritual you can do. And embedded in that Seder was all sorts of symbolism, subtly, and all sorts of commentary, which encouraged the person going through the Seder thinking about this idea of purifying, of going from negative to positive, of renewing the sap in the trees. He turned it into actually an allegory for Shabtai Tzvi, and it was hugely successful in doing so. To the extent that actually many of the Tu B'Shvat Sarim that are done today, which all owe themselves to Nathan of Gaza's attempt to market Shabtai Tzvi, still have elements of it which are actually derived from the Sabbatean movement. It's still present, even despite many efforts by many rabbis to get rid of it. The influence is humongous.
Maybe you answered this, but already, or maybe not. But what I've seen is that most of these messiahs come from Mizrahi or Sephardic, we could say that, communities in Asia. Why do you think that? For example, in Persia, there is a lot of them. It seems that it's a good place for messiahs, and.
It's interesting. I mean, so I've partially, obviously, collated them, and there's some that are missing. And one of the ones that I didn't talk about, which is extreme case, is a guy named Jacob Frank, who was in Poland and followed Shabtai Tzvi, and was, like Jacob Frank was the most extreme in some way, because not only did he make all of his followers be baptized as Christians, but they also were engaged in all sorts of weird sexual orgies and all sorts of inversions and murder, and had this very radical idea that actually you're supposed to do all the bad stuff. He took a Kabbalistic idea that you're supposed to elevate the sparks immersed in the world, the dark sparks, and turned it into a license to kill. And he, really cannot read enough about him. Absolutely fascinating. Recently, one of the prize-winning novels in Poland, you may be aware of, Maria, by Olga Torkosuk, I don't know how to say her name, yes. Is based on, is a novelization of this called The Books of Jacob, which I cannot wait to be translated into English. So there are many Ashkenazi rabbis and individuals who also fit this pattern. I think what's notable about this is that where these things happen are times and places where the surrounding community has a similar belief. So the reason there's a lot of Persia is because the first religion of Persia, long before Islam showed up, is Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism has the basis of all of this, probably is the reason for all of this belief in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that there's an individual who's going to come save the day, right? All of that probably is owed to Zoroastrianism. So that heritage runs very deep in Persia, and is still, by the way, present in some way, even in Islamic Iran. If you look at the way that Ayatollah Khamenei was talked about in the press at the time, he was talked about as a messianic figure who was coming to save the day from the Western oppressor. There's a lot of that language still present. So I think the Jews of Persia were very influenced by that. And similarly, the Jews in Christian Europe at the time that there were revivals of messianism in Christianity were affected as well. And it depends kind of where you are. If you're living in a place where there's a lot of messianism among the non-Jews, then chances are it's going to filter back into the Jews. And that's true of almost every person we've seen, is that they were living around non-Jews who were focused on some kind of messianic expectation. And it just so happened to filter into their own practice as well. Because as we've seen many times, Jews are people too. Believe it or not.
Strange but true.
Strange but true. So I think it's terribly interesting stuff, by the way, looking at this. And we honestly never talk about it. We're afraid to talk about it. And we are doing ourselves a disservice because we owe a lot of our traditions, our beliefs, our practices to these histories of messiah claimants. If you're really interested in nerding out about this, there's a huge and very important book by Gershom Scholem about Shabtai Tzvi called Shabtai Tzvi, which is it's like a doorstop book. But he really paved the way in our understanding of how these people functioned and the effect they had, in particular Shabtai Tzvi. And it clearly is a part of Judaism that's not going away. right? Chabad today is still very much influenced by this and still plays a big role in how many people in Chabad see their movement. And there will be more movements that emerge and have similar views. We're perhaps already seeing some emerge right now. And in 20 years' time, we might see it even more so in Israel and elsewhere. So it's important that we recognize the signs, partially so that we can avoid it and partially so that we can understand it better, because it's very unlikely that we're going to get rid of it entirely. And it's very unlikely that we're ever going to encounter someone who meets all of Maimonides' criteria, but that's kind of the point. So I'm really pleased that you joined me. Apologies that this is more of a lecture than a discussion, but there's just so much to talk about in such a short period of time. Hopefully it'll inspire you to do some research and read more about some of these people. They have fascinating life stories, and it is yes, Melech HaMashiach. David in the chat privately said Bibi the Messiah, which is not actually what I was referencing, but actually is not too far off, in that you see people chanting Hamelech Bibi in crowds and believing that he's the only one who can save them and restore Jewish sovereignty. There's maybe not such a far cry in some ways in contemporary political dialogue, and it may be something we see more of. I don't doubt that we will. So read and study more so that you can identify the signs. And if you'd like to be a Messiah, you can learn from all the greats of the past, learn what to do and what not to do. It would be great if we saw some women Messiahs, by the way. There's a huge dearth of women Messiah claimants. So, if anyone here is interested in taking up that mantle, let me know.